Wolves v Liverpool was an historic event that took place during the last match of the 75-76 season. Liverpool needed at least a draw to take the title away from Queen's Park Rangers, the unlikely challengers to the title. Wolves needed to win to avoid relegation and hope Birmingham lost at their game at Sheffield United. What happened next was the stuff of legends. We have 3 stories from 3 different team supporters. First, we have Wolves fan Mike, who told us, "I walked through the town centre and it was entirely Reds fans, most of them drunk but happy and confident. I managed to get into the North Bank early. It was the most squeezed, packed, tight crowd I have ever been in. The Scousers were all over the South Bank stand, packed in like sardines on top of the old Molineux road stand. On the floodlights just everywhere, it was a sea of red, the first time I had come across fans wearing red, as well as just having scarves. Does anyone remember a Wolves fan running on the pitch before the teams were out from the enclosure with a Liverpool scarf? He went up to the South Bank end, stood on the penalty spot, and wiped his arse on the scarf. 2 Liverpool fans ran on and sorted him out. The St John's ambulance men then took him off to the delight of the red South Bank. It scared me now to think of the North Bank crush. I couldn't get my arms down to my sides. It was a Hillsborough disaster that fortunately didn't happen. There must have been 65,000 in the ground that night, bursting at the seams. I watched a good part of the game wedged sideways in the North Bank. Scary night, and I'm amazed no one was killed. From that angle of view, there were 2 overriding impressions. The first was the human massiveness of the South Bank, packed brimful to overflowing with Scousers, forming a fluid block of 30,000 souls. In the second half, they just seemed to suck the ball towards them as Liverpool chased the game. Each goal caused a mass eruption of noise and limbs, followed by increasingly large pitch invasions. The final whistle saw that surge push thousands of Reds onto the pitch, where they continued to celebrate. Eventually, they surged towards the North Bank, where the Wolves firm had been displaced to. Right up to the boardings surrounding the North Bank, they came to rest, probably looking at the Wolves fans who, don't forget, had been relegated at the same time, and thinking, "Oh, we'd better not push it." And a standoff ensued between celebrating mocking Scousers and angry Wolves. There was no way Wolves were letting Liverpool take the North Bank. They had already taken the South Bank, where the Wolves firm used to run riot. I mean, there's not a firm in the country that could have stopped them that day. Eventually, the police arrived and moved the Reds fans back into their own half. The second impression I got was the team and athletic supremacy of the Liverpool side. We had a decent side, and Richards and Kindon were a formidable partnership. But Liverpool were on a different level entirely. Looking far more powerful, they zipped the ball around at speed and with great accuracy, gradually exhausting the Wolves' back line until they made enough space to score the inevitable goals. I had seen the triumphant Man United side back in 1968 after winning the European Cup in their glory, but this team was even better. I've often thought that night created my impression of how football is played at the very highest level and what every club should aspire to. Liverpool fan Chris told us, "Much was at stake for both clubs. If Wolves won, Queen's Park Rangers would become English champions for the first time, and the Wolves would avoid relegation if they won, and Birmingham City lost at already relegated Sheffield United on the same evening. A low score draw, I think up to 2-2, would take us above QPR on goal average, but any draw higher than that would have given Rangers the title because the goal average between the 2 clubs was so close. As things turned out, Birmingham took a point from their visit to Bramall Lane, and that point would have condemned Wolves to the 2nd division anyway. Back at Molineux, the biggest travelling army I have ever seen during my time as a Liverpool supporter started to arrive from mid-afternoon onwards. Initially there was something that resembled a queue, but an hour or so before the turnstiles opened, there was only chaos and an enormous scrum of people desperate to get inside. That desperation turned to panic, not because people were getting hurt, but because they didn't want to be locked out. Having already been waiting for at least 3 hours, it was obvious that there were more visiting supporters than could fit on Molineux's South Bank. As a double wooden gate was getting pummeled until it gave way, I took my chance and managed to climb inside the stadium through a toilet window. I didn't care about getting in free. It was every man for himself, and I convinced myself that it was about getting inside safely by whatever means necessary. as I made my way onto the massive terrace behind one of the goals. The atmosphere inside the stadium was extraordinary as kick-off approached. I think the fervour, excitement and anticipation was even greater than it would be on another final match May evening 13 years later. Wolves flew out of the blocks and didn't play like a team facing relegation, not in the first half anyway, and deservedly took the lead. Even though our goals came late, they were the result of patient probing as the second half wore on. A major concern was the number of our supporters who got onto the pitch after our goals. I was seriously concerned that the match would be abandoned, and in the little time that remained after Ray Kennedy put us 3-1 up, I remember another Liverpool player, I think John Toshak, blasting an easier chance wide. I'm not saying that was deliberate, but I'm sure all the players understood the serious consequences of hundreds of our supporters coming onto the pitch again. Those hundreds who had invaded the pitch earlier turned into thousands as referee George Courtney blew his final whistle. Having entered Molineux illegally, I left it illegally by wandering down the tunnel and out through the main entrance with nobody challenging me. I knew I had missed the last train that would get me home the same evening, but I got a bus to the centre of Birmingham, where I remember a small group of Birmingham City supporters who had just returned by train from Sheffield chanting "Champions" towards the larger group of Liverpool supporters that were inside New Street Station. They were also celebrating their delight at Wolves' relegation, but seemed genuinely pleased at our success. Most of our support headed north while I headed south through the night. Like Rome in 1977, it was one of those occasions where you could probably find 50,000 Liverpool supporters who claimed to be there. There were definitely more inside the stadium than the official crowd figure of 48,900. It was Bob Paisley's first trophy as Liverpool manager, and it was as magical a night as you can get as a football supporter. If this final match of the season with so much at stake for both clubs had been played on a Saturday afternoon, it would probably have been made all ticket, even though such matches were a rarity in the 1970s. But because it was played on a Tuesday evening, you just did what you usually did at the time. Travel, pay at the turnstiles, or not in my case, watch the match, then travel home. The crushing outside the stadium was unpleasant, but it was an inevitable result of the importance of the occasion. I cannot think of any other fixture ever in the club's history where we took so many supporters to an ordinary away match as opposed to a match at a neutral venue. It remains one of the greatest evenings of my life, as it must be for any Liverpool supporter lucky enough to have been there. This is somewhat unusual for this channel, but we have a third story from QPR fan Martin. If Wolves had beaten Liverpool, QPR would be champions, so Martin and many other QPR fans also travelled to Wolverhampton for the match. Here's his story. For the fans, television was not an option. Sitting with your ears glued to BBC Radio 2 and its then static-filled medium-wave broadcasts was the only option available, unless you felt that you had to be at Molineux in person. 2 coaches were run by the official supporters club. One of the passengers was Robin Haldane, still getting over the events of the previous night at the Dell. Others drove up to Wolverhampton. My father, Frank Percival, and his cousin Peter Robinson were lifelong Rangers fans, and together with my brother and I were season ticket holders in the South Africa Road stand. Rangers did have some stand tickets on sale for the Wolves v Liverpool game on the day of the final home game v Leeds, but understandably Daphne Biggs, the supporters club secretary, would only sell them to people travelling on the official coaches. So we just decided to take our chances. My brother Dave and I left school early, and by 5 p.m. we had arrived in Wolverhampton. The town was already seething with Liverpool fans, with little sign of many home fans. We joined the queue to try and get into Molineux, our blue and white QPR scarves hidden from display. However, I hadn't hidden my scarf well enough, and a guy behind me in the queue spotted it. "What have we got here then? Some Evertonians?" "No," I replied. "Queen's Park Rangers fans." "What the hell are you doing here?" the Liverpool fan asked. "If you lose, we're the champions," was my reply. The Liverpool fans scoffed and said, "We'll not be losing this game, pal." By 5:45 p.m. it was clear that Molineux was already full for the 7:30 p.m. kickoff. The Liverpool fans smashed the gates open at the South Bank end, and a few hundred fans gained entry. But the stewards and police soon stopped the flow of people into the ground, and the queue stopped moving. By 6:45 p.m, we gave up hope of getting in and set off for home. There were still dozens of coaches arriving from Liverpool. There was no way any of those fans would have got in unless they had stand seat tickets. This was, of course, a time when the vast majority of the capacity of most grounds consisted of pay on the day terracing. The official attendance was 48,900, but there must have been at least 10,000 locked out that night. So we had to settle for listening to the game on the car radio on the way home. Surprisingly, Steve Kindon scored for Wolves in the 13th minute. Maybe Rangers would be champions despite the odds. Wolves were still in front with 14 minutes to go, despite great pressure from Liverpool. Agony ensued though, as Keegan, Toshak and Kennedy all scored in the final minutes to win the game 3-1 for Liverpool. It was a very quiet, long journey home for me and all the QPR fans, I would imagine, and we never again achieved such dizzy heights. Our thanks to Mike, Chris and Martin for their insight into what was an intense atmosphere, full of emotion, because of the invasion of thousands of Reds fans that night. There's no way you could call this a taking of an end, more like an inevitable invasion of the Wolves' South Bank. At the time, the away fans went in there anyway, but it also housed the Wolves firm, who would attack opposing fans in large numbers. This is pre-Subway Army, don't forget. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and hit the bell for future video notifications.